Hello chess friends and welcome to Zarov's chess channel and welcome to our Garry Kasparov saga. So in this series we're following Garry Kasparov's life and his chess career from the year 1981 to 2000, and today we're analyzing a game from the 1982 Interzonal tournament that was played in Moscow, and here Garry Kasparov faced Jakub Murey. Jakub Murey was also a strong grandmaster. His peak rating was around 2550, so also respected grandmaster back in the 80s, and in this game Garry Kasparov will play the so-called Garry Kasparov variation of the Queen's Indian, and Garry Kasparov didn't get so many credits for opening theory and for opening preparations. Not many lines are named after Garry Kasparov, but that's not because Garry Kasparov was weak or was bad in openings. It's just that some of these openings have already been revealed. They have already been discovered, for instance, by other grandmasters in the earliest stage of the chess history. So that's why I'm not sure if Magnus Carlsen would get some kind of a line in particular openings, because every opening I think has so far has been discovered, and that's why we shouldn't criticize of course Garry Kasparov because of that fact. So let's check out now the Garry Kasparov variation. It was a very interesting game. It will show again the ability of Garry Kasparov to create dynamics out of seemingly static positions. That's why I really love to watch Garry Kasparov's game. So let's check out now the game. Garry Kasparov opened with the move d4. So knight to f6, we have c4, e6. So after knight to f3, we have the so-called counter Nimzo Indian setup. We don't want to play early with our knight on c3 because bishop to b4 is happening. If bishop to b4 happens immediately, then we could play something like knight to d2 or bishop to d2, and we're not risking some double pawns here on the c file. So b6. We have now sort of a Bogo Indian setup by Jakub Murey, and here Kasparov plays now his variation. This is his setup that he most often played, followed with a3. This a3 move has a huge importance in the continuation of the game. Here, the main line is still probably bishop to b4, pinning the knight immediately. And there are now several choices for white: e3, bishop to d2, and Garry Kasparov most of the times played the move bishop to g5. He pinned the knight back. This is very risky and also an imbalanced position, because after bishop to c3, black will go something like h6, g5 in some occasions. The game will be really dynamic. In the game, Jakub Murey played the move bishop to b7, and he didn't pin Kasparov immediately. And Garry Kasparov says, okay, if you don't want to pin me, then you're not going to pin me in this game anymore. a3 prevents now this positional ideas of blacks. Very important move. This is now a compact position, and here d5 play by Jakub Murey. So what to do now in these types of positions? So here Garry Kasparov plays, I think, the best way: c takes d5. And the problem is now, if black recaptures with the pawn, then you don't have a good activity with your light square bishop. You have played already with your light square bishop. You could maneuver it maybe here to c8 and then to g4. But as I said, in the opening stage, you don't want to play twice with your pieces, and e takes d5 blocks out simply your light square bishop, and that's not the point of this opening. We want to have a compact position, and we want to have a good activity with our light square bishop. So that's why Jakub Murey took the pawn with the knight. So the main idea now of white is to get some kind of an attack on the knight. e4 is not a possibility immediately, because knight takes c3 will happen. Then you lose the defender of the e4 square, and black will simply take the pawn. So that's why queen to c2, preparing this e4 pawn breakthrough, and now c5. Jakub Murey plays a very aggressive move, which is good because he realizes that black could have some troubles in the center, that white can really get this pawn center control, this pawn majority in the center. So here Garry Kasparov finally plays this e4 pawn breakthrough, and we have now knight to c3, b takes c3, and now knight to c6. There is this line, maybe d takes c4 and pardon me, c takes d4 and c takes d4. This is now a similar setup like in the Tarrasch or maybe in the Grunfeld defense, if you're familiar maybe with this setups of blacks. The idea behind these structures in the center is that black some occasions has the opportunity to play bishop to b4, and then after bishop to d2 to simplify further the position. In the Grunfeld, black has a huge activity with potential g6, bishop to g7 ideas, and then with some bishop to g4 ideas. But you see now in this potential outcome in the middle game, black doesn't have any more this kind of opportunities. So that's why here Jakub Murey doesn't take the pawn immediately in the center. He plays knight to c6 with ideas to play the rook to c8 and then discover attacks on the queen. So here Garry plays bishop to b2, and there are many games really in this setup by Garry Kasparov. He plays this bishop. It seems so that the bishop is blocked out so far in the game, but these are mobile pawns. You don't want to block out your pawns. You saw in this previous line, after d5 and maybe c takes d, pardon me, after d5 and c takes d5, if black would have captured the pawn with the pawn, not with the knight, like Jakub Murey did, then this bishop would be blocked because the pawn is not mobile. But in this pawn structure, still we have opportunities to play d5, c4. So this bishop will come into the game. This I'm telling you because this bishop's activity will play a huge importance now in the continuation of the game. Here Jakub Murey played the natural move, rook to c8. So far black played really a great game, great defense. The position is about equal, and here Garry plays also this idea, rook to d1, discovered attack on the queen. Now if something happens, if something changes, if maybe there are some open files, both players have some troubles with the queen on the d file and on the c file. So c takes d4. So finally Jakub Murey takes the pawn, c takes d4, we have c takes d4, and now a6. This was now his first inaccuracy. Knight takes d4, if you ask yourself if that's a possibility, it's not an option because you get simply queen to a4. This knight is lost. If you get back with your knight, then you lose simply the queen. So if bishop to c6 will simply take the knight with the queen. So that's not an option. So that's why Jakub Murey played this move a6, and now this idea couldn't work with queen to a4, as you get b5 and you lose some material. So that's why Garry Kasparov finally maneuvers his queen to the d file, and now we have the move knight to a5, knight to a5. So a better idea instead of this a6 and knight to a5 is simply to play bishop to d6. This leads now into a very complicated line after d5, which is really a pawn breakthrough, which is this dynamic structure that I think Garry Kasparov has prepared here. After e takes d5, okay, e takes d5, but now queen to e7 is very tricky here for white, because you have to trade off the queens, and it leads now into a more simplified line, because you see the bishop to d6 is very important, and now we could create some kind of a blocking system with this knight, with the bishop, and white continues the game with an isolated pawn. Still, this is defendable with, of course, bishop to g7, but it's a more it's a better line, I think, for black than this a6 idea. Here in the game, as said, let's go back. C takes d, and now a6, and this gives now Garry Kasparov the opportunity to create a rook and queen battery, which is very important now in the continuation of the game. You see why? Because now after knight to a5, we have d5, and that's really the Garry Kasparov we know. He creates dynamics immediately all over the board. Here e takes d5, the 5 was played. If you ask yourself what happens if knight to c4, it's again another problem here for white, because the bishop comes out with a tempo, and we need only one move now to castle. That's the main problem. After rook, rook to c4 here, then we could have simply queen to d3 attacking the rook. After b5, simply castling is perfectly fine here. If e takes d5, e takes d5, then we could play rook to e1, and if we get this both of these rooks on the d and e file, this could be a problematic game here for black. So you see, it seems so that in this kind of open positions, it's good maybe to go after the bishop here. But the problem is now this extra tempo that white can get when he gets with the bishop out. So d5, we have e takes d5, and now e takes d5. If now queen to e7 happens, it's again not such a powerful idea. I've analyzed this line. I've asked myself this question: what happens now if queen to e7? Then we have simply bishop to e2. And now after knight to c4, Garry Kasparov has prepared here really a great tactic. It's the move d6. That's the main problem. If you try something like knight takes d2, then you see we can also take the queen. But this d takes e7 comes also with an attack on the bishop. And if you try now knight to f3, the funny thing is after bishop to f3, again, two pieces are hanging. If you take the pawn, we'll simply take the bishop. If you take the bishop on f3, we'll simply promote the queen here, and you have to react and you lose a piece. So it's a completely winning endgame here for white. So what you could do after the move d6 is also maybe knight to d6, but then I think castling. That's our main goal here. Castling, getting the rook on the e-file. Now, I'm not seeing a good way how black should defend this. Maybe to escape somewhere with the king, but I'm not sure. As g7 is g6 bishop to g7 is simply too slow. You see, Garry Kasparov has calculated this very well. Here, let's go back. Again, queen to e7, bishop to e2. If queen to d6 happens now, if you try block it, I think again we can simply kingside castling with rook to e1. So it's really weird position. This pawn is really annoying to handle. In the game, Jakub Murey tried bishop to d6, giving up the pawn on g7. You saw in the previous line it was a good option, but now it's simply a little bit too late. Garry Kasparov simply takes the pawn, attacks the rook, and now we have queen to e7. It's again a little bit too late because we have bishop to e2 and now rook to g8. So again, if you try something like knight to c4, we don't have any troubles as we can maneuver the queen to h6. Again, the rook is hanging. After that, we can take this pawn, or even castling. Again, with bishop sacrifices are possible because black can never take the bishop. We simply play rook to e1. The queen is on the same file like the king, so taking the bishop on e2 is not an option here for black. So after the move queen to e7, as said, bishop to e2, we have rook to g8 and now queen to h6. The queen comes now very actively into the game. White is much better here. The king is stuck in the center. White can always castle. As I said, the rook to e1 idea is simply a serious threat here for black. We have f5, and now Garry Kasparov simply attacks the queen, bishop to f6 here. We have queen to f8, and now Garry simply takes the pawn. Very nice move. If you take the bishop, of course, the rook is hanging, so far it's not a possibility. Here, queen to f7, black is desperately trying to simplify the position, but simplification is not an option here. Queen to f5, simply too much activity against black's king. Rook to g6, and now queen to e4. Again, a check. You cannot cover with the queen. That's the main problem here. If you try to cover with the bishop, we can always takes, and the rook is hanging. So that's also a nice line here for white. So after queen to e4, Jakub Murey escapes with the king to f8, but now a monster move, knight to g5 here played by Kasparov. What to do? If you take with the queen, then you get the fork on h7. Great tactic that Garry saw, of course. Again, taking with the rook is also not an option, as you get knight to h7 with some knight takes f6 ideas. So it's a bad position here. Jakub Murey tried rook to g5. We have bishop to g5, and now rook to e8. But again, it's a little bit too late because Garry Kasparov has this intermediate check, king to g7, and now queen to g4. The king is simply too much endangered here, and this position Jakub Murey resigned, because if you try something like, you see, king to h8, then it will simply play bishop to e3. That's the main tactical threat. You see, bishop to d4 is coming, bishop to d3 is coming. The bishop's activity is simply too much to handle, as I said here, and in this position, Jakub Murey resigned. So, again, a great dynamic game played by Garry with this d5 pawn breakthrough. Really, it impresses me always when I see these types of position. They're really created for such an attacker like Garry Kasparov. Great game. So this was the game 3 of the Interzonal tournament in 1982 in Moscow. So we'll continue to follow this tournament. It was a great tournament, as in this tournament Garry Kasparov will face also the legendary Mikhail Tal, the magician from Riga. So magician from Riga against the beast from Baku in this tournament. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game. I really enjoyed it a lot. It was again a great attacking performance by Garry. If you want to see more games from his career, here's the link. And if you want to see more brutal games, check out my best chess games of all time series, in which I show you all of the best chess games that have been ever played in chess history. And you can also subscribe to my channel if you like this content. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.